Welcome to the second video covering the development of my Unity game. The first thing I did was create a player component, and this was to be able to hold all player related variables, so things such as move speed, speed modifiers, and then the cell and the entity that the player is looking at. This just makes things easier to abstract away all of those variables to another component, so then whatever object wants to know, for example, what entity or cell the player is looking at, they can just ask that player component. I also added some helper methods to the player controller component in order to find the current cell and entity that the player is looking at, as this will be the basis for how the player interacts with the world. The next thing that I did was to create a player cell interactor component, and this was to allow the player interact with all the cells in a grid. More importantly, it would hold all of the entities that the player can spawn. So for instance, if the player can spawn a wall or a trap, then that would be held in the player cell interactor component. This way we can orient all of the entities that the player can spawn with the cells that they're being spawned in. After that, I introduced two states to the player. So the first state being build mode, which is the mode that the player can place structures in, and then the second mode would be the sort of fighting mode where the player can use their weapons and abilities. This would mean that I could show a different UI depending on the mode that the player is in. After that, I started some work on a very basic UI, pretty much just consisting of text, mainly for development use, so I could see the state that the player is in, the cell they're looking at, and the entity that they're looking at. Then, with a basic UI in place, I focused on improving the build mode of the game. I did this by creating a new grid component. The grid component acts as a parent of all the cells and allows us to keep track of all of them. The next build change that I made was to allow cells to find their neighbors. The way that I did this was to add 6 points surrounding the cell in the exact locations that their neighbors would be in. Then at each of those locations, a raycast would check for the existence of another cell and add that cell to its neighbor list. So this way each cell would have a reference to all of its neighbors without having to manually add them in the editor. Instead, they would just dynamically be found during runtime. Now, cells knowing about their neighbors is important because certain structures will require knowledge of their neighboring cells. For example, with walls, if two walls are neighboring one another, then the merlons on the side they connect to shouldn't be visible when they're connected. Another nice thing about this is that if in the future I wanted to add structures which took up more than one cell space, that would be easier to implement because then a cell has knowledge of its neighbors and then that could be taken into account when placing a structure. Then the last thing that I worked on was the creation of a repository, and the way that I did that was create it as a scriptable object. Now, I haven't worked much with scriptable objects before, but there's a really good blog post by Reygn from Shell Games that I found, which details really nicely why you should use them and how you can use them to architect your Unity game. So the idea behind the repository is, instead of, for instance, with the player cell interactor, having, say, a reference to all the entities that the player can place and then manually adding those prefabs. Instead, you kind of have this scriptable object repository which acts as a singleton for holding the references to all the prefabs that we can use in the game, and then you can simply call it, and if you wanted to instantiate it or get details of a particular prefab, then you could do so through the repository. And the repository itself dynamically loads all of the entities from the asset folders within Unity. So again, this way, instead of having to manually drag them in the editor, they'll just be loaded from the folder that they're in at runtime. So that's everything that I managed to work on this time. Next time I'm hoping to work probably a bit more on player movements, so things like jumping and animations, and then gradually start working sort of on the wave system, enemies, allies, fleshing out structures a little bit more, things like that. And thank you for watching.